this is a really important story to tell, and to understand this is particularly now, because, as I was saying before, race is central to our story. Race, race, race. And a lot of people don't like that. And a lot of people don't want to hear about it.
Welcome to the end game. We've got a great episode today with two football legends, both from college and the NFL. Ken Willard, North Carolina, San Francisco 49ers, Clint Jones, Michigan State, mostly the Minnesota Vikings, but also the San Diego Chargers. And their lives cross paths with an untold but important story in college football integration. 1964, September 26th. Michigan Duffy Daugherty, whose teams led college football integration, took the first fully integrated team to the South to play at North Carolina, September 26, 1964. And that was Clint's varsity debut as a sophomore.
Yes.
And Ken Willard was a senior, big man around college football. And before Ken joins us, I'm going to have Clint welcome you to the show. But I want to say this first, Clint. I think of Clint and Ken, I think of both of you guys as college football legends and NFL legends. But it's interesting. It's kind of a timeless dynamic that goes back to high school and college. So Ken was a senior. Clint was a sophomore playing his first varsity game. And so whenever I talk about this game with Clint, he talks about the great Ken Willard. Clint, welcome Ken to the show.
Welcome, Ken. When Tom brought it up, I said, I don't remember scoring a touchdown or anything. All I remember is Ken Willard. That all I remember is you. That's kind of amazing. You're outstanding back, and of course, being back in the days of the running backs, that was really important to me. So when he told me I scored,
I was either going to be a
really?
tackle. I don't know which one, but I ran like a tackle, I guess.
Oh man, you were huge. You're huge. I said, good gracious, that's what I remember about UNC. Ken Willard. You're a fullback, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
I remember it was a hot day. It was a very warm day that day. And the sun was out, and I know we had spent a lot of time reading about and talking about Bubba Smith, who of course was, I guess, what year was he at that time?
Bubba was also a sophomore.
We all sophomore. Bubba, Gene Washington, George Webster, but we came in as freshmen in 1963. Of course, back then you couldn't play any games as a freshman.
Yeah, freshman. Yeah, you couldn't play.
Yeah.
Bubba was he was a phenom at that time. Weren't many linemen his size that could run like a sprinter.
Yeah.
Oh my God! I think we spent a lot of time worried about his reputation that preceded him, and we were concerned, I guess, whether we could handle him.
Yeah.
And what position did he play? Was it defensive end or tackle?
Defensive end, yes, defensive end.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, you had 4 future college football Hall of Famers make their debut. Bubba was a defensive end from Beaumont, Texas, the Underground Railroad. George Webster actually played in a defensive line as a sophomore, and then they switched him to a rover linebacker his All-American years as a junior and senior. And he was from Anderson, South Carolina, and then Gene Washington was from LaPorte, Texas. So 3 of those guys were the Underground Railroad. and then Clint was from Cleveland, Ohio. But the reason I'm glad we got you guys together, I've talked about this on my website before, but I haven't gotten you guys together. So that's what's great about this. And for our listeners, this is a important moment in college football because it was the first time a fully integrated team played in the South. And the way racial progress advances in America is step by step, slow by slow, slowly by slowly. And this 1964 game was just one step towards college football being fully integrated, fait accompli by 1970. But the problem was the sports media in the 60s just ignored these events. They didn't want to address race. Outside of the civil rights movement, they weren't going to address it in sports. So, Clint, you go first, then we'll have Ken talk about it. But Clint, you guys were just excited to be playing varsity football, and it was not a discussion about the history that was being made down there. That's correct, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, we knew what was going on, in the United States and in the world, but primarily we were concerned about football. And of course, guys are still making adjustments, coming from a totally different atmosphere from the South, coming north. But actually, we are focused on football, and that's another thing about it, Ken, is that freshman class of 1963, they built a new dormitory called Wonders Hall. All the incoming athletes stayed in Wonders Hall. Swimming, basketball, whatever sport, they all stayed in that dormitory. And it was a co-ed dormitory. Of course, you had the men on one side and women on the other side. But we bonded and really came together. And back in those days, you had to stay in a dormitory. You couldn't stay off campus. So we had really a unity. So the players coming from the South and the black players coming from the South and players that had no experience being in an integrated situation, we lived together in a fully integrated dormitory. And so, and we ate together. And so that really kind of brought us into being a family, a really diversified family. So by our sophomore year, and see, as freshmen, you can't play anybody else. So you play the varsity. So we just kicked their butt, the varsity's butts, and so some eyebrows, and so Duffy knew he had something, and it proved to be he really had a great crop of outstanding athletes.
The important thing about this game was when black athletes were playing at other Southern stadiums, there were problems with cheap shots on the field, abuse from the fans. And a good example of that was Darrell Hill playing at Clemson. Darrell Hill was the first black player in the ACC, and he played at Clemson in South Carolina in 1963. And he took cheap shots on the field, abuse from the fans. The Clemson people would not even let his mother into the stadium. But at North Carolina, no incidents. Michigan State's players don't remember having anything shouted at them. And Ken, you had told me before that it was not a topic of discussion. They just had a pocket of progress in Chapel Hill that maybe didn't exist other places in the South.
Well, as I said before, we were more concerned about Bubba Smith than we were anything else. I guess we had read too many newspaper articles, but we had not played anybody who had gotten that type of hype coming in, and I honestly do not remember. As you remember, I think I told you we had gone up to Michigan State when Clint was a freshman. Clint, I don't know. I know you probably went to that game.
Yes.
I was a sophomore. Let's see. I was a sophomore. Wait a minute. 1963.
Probably a junior.
63. Now you're a junior.
Yeah. Yes. But Sherman Lewis.
In 1962, North Carolina played at both Michigan State and Ohio State.
Well, anyway, what I was saying was we had been to Michigan State and to Ohio State, and we had been thumped in both places. I dearly remember sitting in the Ohio State locker room before we went out, and we had never played a Big Ten team. And we had a fiery linebacker coach who gave us pep talk before the ball game, and he said, "Get moved." You know, he said, "I hearken back to my military days, and my Marine Corps sergeant said, 'Get moving, you SOBs.'" You know, and the only thing I was thinking was that we weren't going to leave that field alive. And then the very next week, we had to go up to your place and play Michigan State. And I don't know what the score of that ball game was. I think it was 38-6 or something like that. But again, we had experience playing against black players. And so as I remember, there was no big deal or conversation we had coming in to the ball game in 64. So we had played against people. I believe the first person that we had played against, and maybe this was my sophomore year, I thought Darrell Hill went to Maryland.
Yes, he did. He went to Maryland.
Okay.
But he was there 1 year as a senior transfer in 1963.
Okay. Because that was wasn't he the first black player to?
He was the first black player, but like I said, he was a senior transfer in 1963. And he went down to Clemson in South Carolina. And also at Wake Forest, the Wake Forest fans were booing him. And Brian Piccolo came over and put his arm around him and walked around him in the stadium to get the stadium to calm down. But your coach, as you said, you guys had experience playing against black athletes. It wasn't anything new. And your coach and Duffy, it's not something we know about because they weren't asked the questions. They didn't volunteer the information. But obviously your coach was interested in having you guys take up these experiences. Your coach was Jim Hickey, correct?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Your head coach was Jim Hickey, correct?
Jim Hickey, right.
Yeah. And then before him was Jim Tatum. And he was the guy who sent Bobby Bell and Carl Eller to Minnesota. So both those coaches, I think, had open minds. And I think that's pretty obvious by the attitude of your team. Whatever racial attitudes were in the South, they weren't seeping into your team.
Well, again, it wasn't something we thought about. You know, you and I have talked about, I would have thought that maybe there was a bigger problem in where you stayed at that time than playing that ball game because that was unusual to have a desegregated group come in to stay at a motel in that area.
Yeah, that's another interesting thing about Chapel Hill because when I first wrote about this, I tried to I asked the black players at Michigan State where they stayed, and they don't even remember. So for them, it wasn't an issue. But the point being is, if we're making progress here, it's one step, and then the other schools along this in the South are starting to follow along. It's like dominoes. Clint kind of comment about how it's just a gradual process of everybody getting to know each other and accept each other.
Well, that's one thing about culture. Culture brings people together past their differences, because I think people get to know each other as human beings. And so art, music, sports is culture. So, and then education. So to me, sports, education, and dialogue, especially dialogues and peace, that's what brings people together. Politics and social programs never do. There's always other hidden agendas and stuff like that. But culture, that's what really refines human beings, and they realize that our interconnectedness. And that's the beautiful thing about football, because it's really, it represents the gridiron of life. It's something that you can't play football, at our age, or even at 50 or 60. So it's, the year it's short. It's a youthful sport, and but it's a combat sport, and it is actually refined by military people. So
Yeah.
there are a lot of lessons to be learned in playing this game. It's like, we just had the honor of having our 65 and 66 team inducted into the Michigan State Hall of Fame. And that was in the second week in September. And that would have never happened had it not been for the president, who was from the University of North Carolina, the chancellor at the University of UNC, Kevin Guskiewicz, who was hired in March at Michigan State. And we had a committee that started last October and has been, in the works for a long time. And we felt, they talk about the iconic All-Americans, Bubba Gene Washington, George Webster, Bubba Smith, and Bobby Pisa. But football is a team sport. It's not an I sport. It's not a me sport. It's a we sport. So what happened was that we even got a letter. We had a committee consisted of players to find the criteria of why our team should go into the Hall of Fame. And so there's never been something like that happened before. So that started last October, and we met with the AD. So in May 20th this year, we got a letter from the assistant who was communicating with the committee, consisted of myself and other teammates. And they said, well, we're not going to be able to do it. We're not going to do it right now. And about 6 weeks later, I got a call from the AD, Alan Haller, saying, Clinton, I want you to be the first to know, but we're going to be inducting you, both teams into the Hall of Fame in this fall. And I said, great. But and so then I got a call from Kevin Guskiewicz, our new president, and congratulating us. So I texted him and I asked him, I said, Kevin, I said, did you have anything to do with this? And he texted me back the next day and he said, let's say, I'm kind of paraphrasing, rolled a few eyes or heads and said, why wouldn't you do that? And that's when so that connection going back to Chapel Hill, and Kevin and I became friends when I went to Chapel Hill for one of the trusts. They have these brain and body examinations that they do.
Right.
I went there last November 13th to the 17th. And so that's when Tom, with his passion, arranged that we meet with the chancellor's assistant, Candace Gerger, and we wound up becoming good friends. And then I started sending Kevin information about the history of Michigan State's football team. So he had a thorough history of it. And see, Michigan State has had the reputation of not tooting their own horn. And then kind of this thing stuck in the mud and not doing anything progressive. And they've been that way since the time that I was in school, because John Hanna, Duffy Daugherty, Biggie Munn, they're very progressive, as seen by our record. But they haven't had nearly had the accomplishments that we did as national champions since we left. So Kevin, coming from Chapel Hill, he came in there with a new paradigm. He said, and so, it's very mystical how that worked out.
And then amazing. Now he was the chancellor at Chapel Hill, was he not? Before.
Yes.
Yeah. What happened was he was the chancellor at Chapel Hill, and when I heard Clint was going to be in the area, I said, Clint, we got to try and get into Kenan Stadium and have you relive that moment, because you were the first Black person to score a touchdown at Kenan Stadium. And I connected with Candace Gerger, and she fortunately is a sports fan and was not only intrigued by the story, she cleared all the hurdles we had to do to get into the stadium. And since she already had worked for Kevin in the past at the Brain and Body Center, she had a relationship with him. And Kevin was actually on his way out to the stadium to meet me and Clint. He was interested in the story.
Yes.
But that was the day that the news broke in Michigan State that he was the leading candidate, so he had to keep a low profile. But it's just funny how something would come full circle 60 years later, because if you read my book, The Right Thing to Do, and in my first book, Ray of Light, the big thing I keep pushing is that Michigan State has never understood its history. One reason for that is Duffy Daugherty was not a self-promoter. And the other is the sports media's failure to understand what Duffy Daugherty was doing and what was happening at other schools. Michigan State stands apart from Minnesota that had a handful of black players from the South that were steered to Murray Warmath by Jim Tatum. Was just, he stumbled upon him. Duffy Daugherty had a network of black coaches throughout the South. Bubba Smith's father being the primary one. George Webster's coach called Duffy. And they knew Michigan State was a North Star for black athletes because they had seen Michigan State's 1954 and 56 Rose Bowl teams with black All-American players. So that's where it all started. But college football lore has lumped Michigan State in with other schools. And this is another point I keep trying to hammer away. People don't understand. USC was one of the many schools, I should say all of the schools, except for Michigan State, that followed an unwritten quota in the 60s. They didn't want more than a half dozen black players because they thought there would be fights in the locker room and white guys wouldn't follow the leadership of a black player. USC did not end that until the late 60s. But because of this 1970 USC Alabama myth, Bear Bryant, who dragged his feet on integration until 1970, gets more credit than Duffy Daugherty. So that's the crusade I've been on. And that's why I think it's important to tell this story, because this was 6 years earlier, and it wasn't the only example. Wake Forest desegregated in 1964, so they were playing throughout the South in the 60s. Jerry Levi's went at SMU. They won at Auburn in 1968. There was nothing new or shocking when USC arrived at Alabama in 1970. And the other thing is, I mentioned the unwritten quota. USC only had 4 black starters in that game. And it's true they had 18 black players, but 11 of them had arrived as junior college or 4-year school transfers, one of them being Tony Smith, Bubba Smith's brother. So in other words, they were down in single digits without turning to the junior college. So it's important history to tell, and that's why I wanted to get you two guys together. Ken, I'd like you to comment about, because you grew up in Virginia where there was also Jim Crow, and then you go down to Chapel Hill and things were pretty progressive. And then, of course, when you went to the 49ers, you're going to have a lot of black teammates in the NFL and playing against black players. How important was that North Carolina experience for you? What did you learn?
I'd love to say something very philosophical, but I just accepted it as what we had. The black player versus white player equation never entered my mind. I was more concerned about the athletic ability of the person I was playing against, to tell you the truth. Now, just like everybody else, we're all affected by where we're raised, et cetera. But you got to remember that Chapel Hill was a very liberal college. I was there the first year of Dean Smith, and Dean Smith became head coach in my freshman year, and he was the first. He recruited the first black basketball player in the ACC, and that was Charlie
Scott.
Charlie Scott. And that was, I don't know what year that was, maybe 1966 or 67. Maybe
I think
late.
that was right.
But Dean was extremely, so I think the whole pervasive aura of going to school there was something that we were just a little bit further ahead in our thinking than some other people. I mean, we've always had the reputation of being a very, very liberal school. And And thankfully, we were that way at that time.
Yeah, Clint, we kind of skipped over your touchdown and just the whole experience of that game.
Well, you
And you don't
skipped
really
over. I
remember
skipped
it,
over.
but
I didn't even remember it.
I know. But what does it mean to you now to know that?
Well, it means well, it's just you know, it's I can't say if it's a memory because I don't remember it, but I'm proud to have to of the history, you know. That's, you know, in retrospect, I say, you know, everything is interconnected. Everything in life is, you know, and it's like a big web, a matrix, and to see how things have materialized over the years, it's like, you know, this happens because of that, and that happens because of this, and it's just, to me, it's exciting to come, you know, full circle to us being on this Zoom right now, you know. And if it hadn't been for all these things in the past, we wouldn't be here right now having this Zoom call. So that's
Yeah.
what I find very significant. And you know, it's like, and this is nothing that was planned, you know, it's just how life kind of unfolds. And to me, it shows that like you see, to bring about change is gradual, especially significant change, and bringing people together, because essentially, you know, we say it theoretically, but it's a fact. Humanity is really just one family. It's just like flowers, you know. It's just, you have different species, different colors, and things like that. And so, you know, I think that as human beings, we're still growing and learning, you know, how to be human beings, what it means to be human. And but you know, you see it in sports. Yeah, look at the evolution of football, you know. Now they're playing with basketball shorts.
We'll
Yeah.
kind of wrap up here, but I want to bring up one historical point that I realized from my last conversation with Ken. We've already pointed out that in 1964, Ken's a senior in North Carolina when Michigan State is the first fully integrated team to play in the South in the 1964 season. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there was an unwritten quota in college football where there were very few black athletes, only about a half dozen or so on teams. So the NFL draft was predominantly white players until Duffy's players started to come along and graduate. And in the 1967 draft, the 4 of the first 8 picks were Michigan State guys. Bubba Smith by the Colts, number 1. Clint by the Vikings, number 2. George Webster by the Oilers, number 5. Gene Washington by the Vikings, number 8. And overall, there were 10 black players in the first round of the 1967 draft, which was a reflection of more black players in college football and the unwritten quota going away. The previous year, there were only 2 black players taken in the first round. And by the time Ken finished his long NFL career, the 49ers were looking for a new fullback. And who do they draft? The first black player at Alabama in 1970. So you kind of a couple of bookend historical moments on college football integration, Ken.
Wilbur Jackson. Wilbur Jackson was a number 1 draft choice.
And Ken, comment on your 1 year with Don Coryell, because he was on his way to the Pro Football Hall.
The greatest character I've ever been around. You know, what I remember most about Don is he coming out to the field one day in practice. And Don,
let me interrupt you, Ken. That was with the St. Louis Cardinals.
That was the St. Louis Cardinals.
Coryell went there in 72, and he turned things around right away. They were competitive with the Cowboys, and you were there for 1 season with them.
I was there in the season of 1974. And so I got credit for 11 years. I played with San Francisco for 9 years, then I was traded to St. Louis and got injured the year I went to St. Louis. Ironically, when we came back and played San Francisco, I had my first knee injury. And so I was operated on, but I came back and played the rest of the year. I missed 5 games in 1974 after having knee surgery, and came back and played the rest of the season. That was the first time the Cardinals had been in the playoffs. against the Minnesota Vikings, by the way. And that was 1974, and so I don't know what year the playoff was, whether it was in 75 or not, but I do remember going up there again, and it was Coldernell again.
But what Coryell did with the San Diego Chargers was no surprise to you, I'm sure, after your
He was
time with-
unbelievable. He had the greatest offensive mind of anybody I've ever been around. And he was the type of guy who would come up to you. Don had a little bit of a lisp, and he'd come up to you and he said, "Oh, it's so nice to have you here." He was a genius, but a mad scientist, so to speak, and
Right.
tremendous guy.
Yeah. And he finally made the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2023, thanks to a lot of pushing from Dan Fouts.
He deserved it.
All right. Final comments on history from Clint and Ken.
Well, it's really a privilege and honor to be a part of history and history making events, So and I'm certainly privileged, to have had the career that I had, and in college and professionally, and also beginning in high school, Cathedral Latin High School in Cleveland, Ohio. I mean, that was where my beginnings, and so it's been a beautiful journey, and I'm proud, privileged to be on the Zoom call with the great Ken Willard, the great Arthur Thomas Shanahan,
We're, you might say we're legends in our own mind.
Yes.
Well, the best compliment I get when people read my books, especially from Michigan State graduates and fans, is I'm so proud of my school because so much of this history is not known. It hasn't been told properly. But I imagine, Ken, when I've told you the story about Michigan State's players and not having any problems at Chapel Hill, I imagine you have a little pride in that.
Oh, absolutely.
Your school.
I'm very proud of the fact that we honestly, and I can say this, I don't remember ever having a conversation, and not even one conversation about the color of the ball player we were going to play. We were more concerned about how good they were. And so there was a little fear there. But yes, I'm very, very proud of the fact that we seem to be ahead of our time.
Great. All right. Well, thanks for watching the End Game, and share this video with as many friends as you have so that they can know the true story of college football integration taking place in the 1960s.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, gentlemen.
All right, guys.
Clint.
Great rest of the year.